Well, good afternoon. We are covering Georgia's youth. We are in chapter 6 of The Baby Thief. We're going to start off. Georgia Tan was obsessed with women of Molly's social class. She was most interested in the frequency of their pregnancies, about which she had contradictory feelings. She was contemptuous of their fertility and privately referred to them as quote-unquote cows. Yet she envied them for their ability to give birth. And while Georgia felt superior to these young women, she also identified with them. This connection touched the most painful part of herself. Early in my research, I ascertained that Georgia had been hurt during her early years. Anxious to understand her, I drove from Memphis to her hometown of Hickory, Mississippi. My timing lacked felicity, for when I began the 300-mile ride, the temperature was close to 100, and pain from an ear infection was a constant throbbing presence. I was scarcely outside Memphis when I crossed the state line into Mississippi, traveling south on Highway 55. It was as generic as any interstate was, so signs I was venturing into the deep south were subtle. An intensification of heat and atmosphere closeness, roadside mud changing from Memphis drab brown to Mississippi fiery red. The vegetation became vaguely tropical. Virginia creeper, cane, buckvine, cypress, and gum. The few animals I saw were roadkill. Reaching the outskirts of the state capital, I turned onto Route 20, traveling east past occasional roadside stands to Hickory, which had a population of 470. A town so tiny it didn't appear on my road map, but lay between Jackson and Meriden. All I knew of these larger cities was that they had been near the sites in the 1960s of the murders of 3 civil rights workers and Medgar Evers of the NAACP. Much has changed since then, and I was neither on civil rights business nor black, but awareness that I'd be considered more than an outsider here than in Memphis accompanied me. As I honed in on my tiny target, as inexorably as the pain in my ear. Earlier attempts to speak with Hickory natives by phone had met with mixed results. Some residents couldn't understand my northern speech. One man, to whom I'd repeatedly tried to explain myself, handed the phone to his wife with an expiration. "Mabel, there's some damn foreigner on the line." And while many of the 25 Hickory residents with whom I spoke patiently recounted decades-old events, several male citizens refused to talk to me. 2 who'd work as handymen in Georgia's Memphis orphanage adamantly swore they hadn't. Not everyone had been straight with me in Memphis, of course. Once I bent to record what one of several public officials had said, I sensed him winking at the others. As I left his office, he phoned the next person on my list. I never learned how he ascertained the order of my visits. I had learned that he was more graciously some Memphis... Wait. I learned that more... Sorry. I had learned that the more graciously some Memphis public figures spoke to me, the less I could rely on the truthfulness of what they said. Pausing there. So basically, they're lying to her. They're being open. They're quote unquote speaking, but they're not actually telling her the truth. And that's kind of like what we were talking about earlier in this book, how, they want a quote unquote investigation, but then they're stalling at every turn, right? They're blocking it. So there really was no investigation. It was all just for show. And that's what this is giving. I thought I hated the artificial politeness, but dealing with the Mississippians, I mourned its absence. It was as if their coarser, hotter climb had stripped them of a veneer Memphians considered essential. In Mississippi, tempers were short and feelings raw. Quote, "We're a clannish group till we get to know you," a Hickory woman had earlier told me over the phone. The time between now and till being measured in generations, not years. Being in a comparative hurry, and I was delighted to discover that 85-year-old Maisie thawed more quickly than did some other locals. By the end of our first conversation, she had not only offered the interpretation of the moral of George's tale, which referring to the reduced circumstances in which her heirs had been left, she expressed as "sin will find you out," but offered to do some sleuthing for me. Throughout the next several weeks, Maisie had called me frequently with tidbits gleaned from a local courthouse and Georgia's former neighbors. She also sent me an article about Georgia recently written for the Meridian Star by a local reporter, who, in a phone conversation, explained why so few in Hickory would speak with me. They resent how Mississippians have been portrayed in the national media as barefoot, watermelon seed spitting rednecks, she said, and she said that the Hickory residents felt their town was known for only one thing, spawning Georgia tan, and that they were embarrassed. So I can totally see that. When your town is known for such a horrific thing or person, right? And the shame that comes with that, I can definitely see that, right? So I have just been to Salem, Massachusetts. I'm working on something for this channel. And while, yes, it's very much known for the dark history in the Salem witch trials, they kind of also embraced it, like there was a lot of bad things, obviously, that happened, right? We're not going to deny that, but there were other things at play as well, and they grew from there. There's places that, they take the one person, whether it's bad or good, and they use it to their advantage to have a little tourist spot. Now, that being said, this is a very tiny town, right? And I'm pretty sure most people don't know who Georgia Tan is unless you're in the adoptee sphere, and you're doing a lot of research and you're understanding what we're talking about. So I don't think it may necessarily be a spot for most people unless we're really investigating. Whereas someplace like, oh God, I can't think of the place. I think it's in Mississippi. There's a small town, and it was where Walt Disney was born, and they made his home into a museum, right? A very, very small town. Even though Disney is known for other things, and, we have Disney World and Disneyland and etc. And there's, like, other locations about Disney, right? So they kind of made it known, right? I don't know. I kind of understand what they're saying. I guess I'm kind of like, yeah, it sucks. Yeah, there's a lot of towns that are small and that have a dark history. Should they necessarily embrace it? I don't know. They could use it as a touristy spot, I guess. I don't know how to explain it. I'm not saying that they should make money off well, I guess they could. But you could honor the bad by not forgetting. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not all these people's fault about Georgia Tan. Does that make sense? Like, no one is truly... Let me rephrase that. I'm going to say the majority of people are not going to be responsible for another person, right? That doesn't negate that there isn't parents, if she, and we're just going through a little bit, if she had been, through trauma, the person that caused that trauma, if it wasn't her parents, teachers and stuff, there may be like small roles of responsibility, but I don't think it's just one person. I don't think it's an entire town. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Like, you can be through the most traumatizing life and choose to do better, right? We have the choice to be kinder, to educate ourselves, to have more empathy, to have more understanding. And, or you could choose to be a horrible person and choose actions that hurt others, right? I'm going to take a moment here. It's a little bit personal for me. So for example, my bio father, according to his record, was a horrible person. Okay, he hurt quite a few people, including raping my older half brother. Now, my older half brother was quite young, right? He was, I think, 3 or 4 at the time, and he went to go live with my great grandparents, right? So kinship. And from there on, yes, he was quite young, and definitely we could talk about what resources should have been given. But you can choose, like I said, to have empathy. You can choose to do better and not be anything like our father, right? Or you can choose to go down that route and do the same thing to another person, which unfortunately he did. And that makes me sick to my stomach, because I've fought my entire life knowing the horrible, well, I shouldn't say my whole life, but majority of my life, knowing about some of the horrible things that my bio father has done. And I've always fought against, I don't want to be anything like that. I do not want to continue that cycle, right? And that also includes substance abuse. I don't want to go down that route. And, well, most days I'm no problem. When you're going through depression and you're going through times, there could be a moment where you want to choose that substance abuse, right? I'm not saying the other things, but you could choose the substance and drown it out, right? But I'm a cycle breaker, right? That's so important. And so I'm giving that concept, that idea of being a cycle breaker. Georgia Tann could have, right? I say could have been like that. Instead, she chose to be horrific to so many people, not just how she hurt young children and babies, right? But how she treated staff, how she created a black market for adoption and created this, monetization of private infant adoption. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use your trauma, right? And how you use it will impact other people, whether it's good or bad. I choose to use my trauma to continue to educate and empathize and be understanding. Now, I'm not always perfect, right? I don't claim to be perfect. I still have a lot to learn. I still have my moments where I get frustrated with people and so forth. But I'm not choosing a route to want to do harm, right? To benefit from harm being done. So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to continue on with this chapter, which I just lost my place. Hold on, guys. Where were we? I think this is where we were. Okay. Here we are. The reporter's status as a local, she emphasized, had been crucial to her inducing residents to talk to her for her piece. But she hadn't approached the cabin of Jack Hendricks, who had served as George's mother's chauffeur. When I asked her why, for I too wanted to speak with him in person, earlier attempts at phone conversation having been thwarted by his deafness. She said matter-of-factly, "Some folks around here shoot first, ask questions later." Shoot even an insider like her? It was a sobering thought. But she and Maisie stressed the importance of my having a local liaison when I visited Hickory. The reporter and I set a lunch date, after which she introduced me to several residents. Maisie, who eagerly awaited my trip, would be my main guide. "I have a '72 Cadillac. We'll meet and go rambling," she said. I was looking forward to having someone to ramble with that scorching July morning. As I approached Hickory, following several solitary days in Memphis, Hickory had no hotel, so as Maisie had suggested, I checked into a motel in nearby Newton, a town set up upon subtle elevations, less hills than swells, and soil faded from northern Mississippi's red to the yellow of the mid-state. My attempts to call Maisie and the reporter was stymied by the fact that I couldn't make long-distance calls from my motel, and that Hickory, 10 miles away, was considered long distance. Oh my God. I'm sorry. I'm laughing because that is so relatable to a place where I grew up, part of where I grew up between New York City and upstate New York. In our cabin upstate New York, at one point, even calling into town because we're so far out on the farm, even calling the next town over, which is like less than 4 miles away, was considered quote unquote long distance. It's now changed, so don't get me wrong, but like I remember those days, and that was the early 2000s. Okay, so let's remember that there are still places very much rural where it's just like that, right? All right. Driving into Hickory, where my call to Maisie resulted in a busy signal, I decided to look around on my own. It seemed foolish to have arranged escorts. Hickory didn't look sinister, but simply tired. An old lumber camp and former sawmill town, it was founded in 1815, when its forests of ash, hickory, poplar, and magnolia were virgin. The mill provided employment for most of the town's residents, and folks considered themselves, compared to other Mississippians, fairly prosperous. Today, however, the mill is gone. The town's gas station has closed, and citizens look to nearby Meridian for their needs. Hickory's one-block center resembled a ghost town, and I was so impressed by its quiet and so diverted by my ear pain that I had overlooked one of its odder characteristics. There were no street signs. This would make finding interviewees difficult. I looked for something that resembled a city hall. A man in a rocker directed me to a temporary appearing structure, an unpainted partition joined to a building. Entering, I found myself in a narrow passageway. On my left was a square cut in the wood, a crude window through which I looked into a sparsely furnished office. A ceiling fan rotated desultorily. Oh my gosh. Flies buzzed overhead. The three adults inside looked up. I asked for a street map. A heavy-set man in a t-shirt asked, "What do you need that for?" "I have to find particular houses," I answered. He looked blank. "There are no street signs," I said. "Oh, yeah," he said and laughed. "The high school kids took them down last year, and we haven't gotten around to putting them back." Again, small town antics, okay? Yeah. Not saying it's good. I just, yeah. You guys get the point. Well, I may have a map. May I have a map? I asked again. I must have been the first person to make the request, for not one of the three seemed to know if a map of Hickory existed. After 10 minutes, the heavy-set man produced what looked like the original plans for the town, but they were useless, showing few streets, and those few lacked names. Luckily, however, the 3 City Hall employees knew everyone in town. I copied down such directions as go 3 streets south, turn right at the Huckleberry Bush, and after a brief stop at what seemed a convenience store where I bought aspirin and fruitlessly asked for over-the-counter eardrops, I set off to my first appointment. It was with a gracious older woman who lived within the site of the old town homestead, where Georgia had been raised, and which Georgia had visited frequently throughout her life to see her widowed mother. Beulah. I hear you tried to buy eardrops at the 5 and Dime, she said as she poured me iced tea. The store didn't resemble a 5 and 10-cent store. It smelled of old meat, but the woman was kind, and I nodded. Less defensive than some other residents with whom I'd spoken by phone, she insisted impossibly that Georgia had been pretty, real friendly, and the sweetest thing, that they had thought the world of her and wished they'd known her better. My hostess made no judgments about her, but simply told me the birth and death dates of Georgia Hickory's relatives and of how Georgia had tried unsuccessfully to persuade a local woman to send her young daughter, who had Down syndrome, to Memphis, where Georgia said she would teach her to talk. My hostess had no idea why Georgia wanted to teach the girl to speak, or considered herself qualified to do so. She was on firmer ground discussing Georgia Hickory's homestead, which in its prime during the 1930s had been the largest and most beautiful in town, with servants' quarters and a brick courtyard, a large wraparound porch, fountains, imported palm trees, and a room-sized walk-in cooler that provided the only refrigeration in town. The palm trees and much else had been paid for by Georgia. Folks here did wonder, she admitted, how she afforded it. We were briefly interrupted by a man my hostess had arranged to meet me, since he had, as a teen, done errands for Georgia. She was a boss man. She ordered me around, he said, but he knew little else about her. Heard you try to buy eardrops at the 5 and Dime, he said as he left, and my hostess and I began the short trek to Georgia's homestead. En route, we passed parched shrubbery that I viewed through a sort of haze. My companion, clad like me in lightweight cotton, looked crisp, but between the oppressive heat and my fever, which was spiking, I was slick with sweat. The sidewalk undulated upward, and ringing my ear rose to a roar. Passing several small houses, I wondered how many locals knew of my store visit, and whether, behind faded curtains, eyes watched me as I made my dazed way. George's homestead was less imposing than I had imagined it, mostly because although it was occupied by the owner of the 5 and Dime, it had been allowed to deteriorate. Its white shingles needed paint, and its grounds were overgrown by poison ivy. I stepped gingerly, trying to imagine the courtyard with flowers and hedges blooming, the fountain spouting water, and the brilliantly colored parrot Maisie had described squawking at my approach. It took more imagination than I could summon at the moment, and soon afterward, I bade my hostess goodbye and drove back to the phone booth to call Maisie. She answered on the first ring. "Maisie, it's Barbara. Let's ramble," I said. "I'm sick," she answered flatly. "What?" "I'm sick. I can't see you." She said she wouldn't say what she was sick with. "Maisie, I'm right here. I'll bring you lemonade," I told her. I can't do it. She sounded scared and suddenly too old to press. I wished her well, said goodbye, and dialed the reporter's work and home numbers. I couldn't reach her. Feeling a queasiness that had nothing to do with my ear pain, I proceeded to my next appointment. I held great hope for this interview, which was to be with a 90-year-old woman whose mind, I'd been told, was as clear as glass, and who had vivid memories of Georgia, who'd been her contemporary and her neighbor. I knocked on her door, which was opened by one of her sons, a large man in his 60s, wearing bib overalls. He led me into the tiny, stifling hot living room, where a sweet-faced woman sat in a wheelchair. Crossing his arms over his chest, he stood facing me on her right. A slight shorter but otherwise identical appearing brother stationed himself on the left. Introducing myself, I asked her a question. Her sons cut her off. George's mother was the most respected woman in Hickory, said a taller one. Her daddy, was a federal court judge, said the other. Their comments were apropos of nothing. I hadn't asked about George's parents. The tan home was the second one built in town. There were no streets then, only paths through the woods. The room spun as I tried to extricate the sweet-appearing old lady from her boys, but they stood firm and clamored on with such inconsequentialities as George's brother Rob liking to hunt possums. Thank you, I told the older lady as I rose to leave. The taller man came over, and his hands on my shoulder pressed me back into my chair. Now, Missy, he said, not so fast. I'm not large, but I am strong, and I could have immediately escaped. But I sat there feeling boneless as he raved about outsiders butting in, snooping around. His brother yelled about the Civil War. You Yankees brought them N-words down here through the underground tunnels. We used them, and we took the rap. Sorry, the whole word is written, but I refuse to say it, so just letting you know there is that word. I looked for help to the old lady, who seemed to have lost her sweetness. Wrenching away from her son, I left and once again called the reporter at the Meridian Star. She's not available, someone told me. I told myself not to become paranoid. My left hand pressed to my ear to counter the pressure inside it. I drove to my next interview. This source lived 20 miles from Hickory in a remote area that I realized could prove menacing. But she sounded friendly when she'd phoned me, and driving down a twisted dirt roads in shade provided redwoods and pines, surrounded by wood scent so sweet it almost distracted me from my ear. I felt myself relax. Her home was a rundown cottage that appeared to have been built at two different times, of two kinds of colors of shingles. I knocked on the screen door, and a man about 70 appeared. He wore shorts and a stained undershirt. He carried something long. I'm delirious, I thought. I'm here to see, I said. She doesn't want to talk, he answered. He raised his shotgun level with my face. For a moment, I stopped breathing. Then I ran to my car, in which I peeled back down the dirt roads, through Hickory to Newton, then west on Route 20, on the way to the Memphis airport and Freedom, away from the shotgun and poison ivy, and most straining of all, the eyes. They seemed to have stolen myself. My confidence caused me to forget who I was. Even if I'd been born there, I thought confusedly I would never have been accepted. I wouldn't have quilted or canned well enough. I would have read too much. A siren shrilled behind me. I was pulled over to the shoulder, where I was ticketed for driving 87 miles an hour. I drove more slowly afterward, of course, but it wasn't until I landed in Cleveland, Ohio, where I then lived, that I felt competent, in control, the person I thought I had long made myself. Someone who would ask whatever questions she wanted, and if she chose, never again to enter a five and dime. Recovering recovery of my sense of control had been contingent upon leaving Hickory. Over the next few months, I realized that Georgia had, to an infinitely greater extent than I had been robbed of choice in her hometown. It was her desire of autonomy that drove her to sell children. Few watching Georgia grow up, however, would have ascertained her frustration. She seemed charmed. Her mother, Beluya Yates Tan, was from a prominent Philadelphia, Mississippi family whose roots stretched back to frontier times. George's father, George C. Tan, had an even more distinguished lineage. His grandfather had served under William Henry Harrison at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and his father was a Confederate war hero. George himself was the most educated man in the county, an aficionado of classical literature, and a judge of the Mississippi Second Chancery District Court. But while George was respected, he wasn't well liked, for he was arrogant, argumentative, and domineering. He was also recalled a former neighbor, a womanizer. Oh, me. He'd go out of town to see women or have them come right to his office in broad daylight. I don't know how Beluya stood it. Setting a pattern, Georgia would follow. He was an emotional, cold person who who evinced little affection for children, but became known for finding homes for orphans. Sounds familiar, right? Social work would not be Georgia's first choice of career. Her father's child placing work was even less intentional. The poor rural Mississippi of the 19th century lacked a centralized agency responsible for homeless children, and Chancery Court judges like George were charged with their care. The scarcity of orphanage often forced magistrates to send children to workhouses or to state asylums, and as insensitive as George was, he was apparently frustrated by his lack of options. Quote, I wish I had a judge, a school teacher, and a good far-seeing minister to sit as a committee and help me decide what would be done with these children, he frequently told his younger daughter. Her earliest memory was of him, quote-unquote, always bringing children home with him for temporary care. Okay, I'm going to pause there. Could it be possible, and I say could, I'm not saying it's definite, that Georgia might have felt a little bit of jealousy towards these children, that she didn't have her father's affection the way that these children did, that she didn't get the attention the way that these children did? That could cause a lot of trauma. Now, again, I'm not saying that's an excuse for her behavior. I want to make that very, very clear. But we've heard stories of biologically kept children being jealous or being treated differently than that of their foster and or adoptive siblings, right? And the jealousy between the two and the sibling rivalry, I think it could play a huge role. It's definitely something that I think maybe we should dive into at another point. I'm just bringing this up here for you guys. What are your thoughts and opinions? Do you have this experience in your family? I do not, so I'm not going to speak on that from a personal experience. But just, what do you guys think? Anyway, let's continue on. Georgia's second cousin told me that the Judge Tan kept and adopted one of these children, who grew up as Rob Roy Tan. Rob was born 3 years before Georgia, in 1888. Other relatives claim that Rob was not adopted, but born to George and Beluga. Since Mississippi doesn't keep birth records from before 1912, and that the state adoption records are sealed, I couldn't verify Rob's origins. But Georgia was named after both of her parents. Her given name was Beluga George. The fact that Rob wasn't given his father's name suggests that Rob joined the family after his younger sister's birth. Another possibility is that Rob was adopted before Georgia was born, but that George didn't want to give his name to an adopted child. Whatever Rob's origins, he was different from George. Beluga and Georgia, he was thin, they were heavy-set. And Rob was a gentleman. An elderly Hickory man who had operated the town service station told me. I thought a lot more of him than the others. Rob was also physically weaker than his sister, prone to ear infections and mysterious fevers. While serving in World War I, he suffered what was called a shell shock, and for the rest of his life suffered from tremors. He died of tuberculosis at age 46. A former neighbor recalled him lying on his mother's porch during his last summer. Every time she wiped his brow, he thanked her. She said, Rob may have been his mother's favorite. Georgia was her daddy's child. With her wide brow, unusually low-set ears, she resembled him. She was even more like him inside, imperious, brilliant, a natural leader. Perhaps it was inevitable that the two such familiar people would clash. One reason for their conflict may have been George's discomfort over George's sexual orientation. It's impossible to discern how much either understood about it during their childhood. Homosexuality was seldom spoken of then in the South, and the word lesbian was virtually unknown. But both sexes had clearly democratic rules, and Georgia never conformed to the image of the Southern womanhood. Big-boned and broad-shouldered, with a blunt, muscular manner, she occasionally appeared in public in flannel shirts and trousers, unacceptable clothing for women, at least during her time, right? She wore her hair severely pulled back, and as an adult, sometimes had it cut as short as a man's. She evinced no interest in marriage, and unlike most other girls of her time, Georgia wanted to pursue a career, the masculine-seeming profession of law. George wanted her to become a concert pianist. Conflicts between parents and children are sometimes of little consequence. That the disagreement within the Tan household led to so much more than can be partly attributed to the tenacity of the characters involved. George was known for his iron will, while Georgia possessed an extraordinarily strong personality and drive. Under any circumstance, she would have made a mark, and had her early life been easier, she might have accomplished much good. But she became so preoccupied with self-protection as to become selfish, narcissistic. Georgia lacked empathy. This made her dangerous. Okay, I'm gonna stop there for a moment. Okay, so I'm gonna just take this moment to make a note. Number one, women were supposed to be dainty and supposed to wear, dresses and be homesteaders, right? That's not to say that women didn't work, but typically white women specifically, this is how they were seen, right? Black women and other women of, other races were forced to work, especially as servants, right? Now, and they still had to wear dresses, and there was still a lack of education for women during this time, even for white women. But I also want to make it very clear that we didn't know about Georgia's being a lesbian, and I don't think that really has a huge impact on why she is the way she is. You can completely take that out and everything still holds true, right? I'm going to make that very clear. Georgia Tann is who she is, not because of her sexuality. And knowing all the horrific things she's done to children, I think it's very dangerous for us to put on the LGBT community that this woman, did what she did because of that. And I don't think that Barbara here is insinuating any of that. I think she's just trying to explain her life away that, being part of the community, the LGBTQ community wasn't very well accepted back then, but especially in the South, right? Like, even now, yeah, you might have some pockets that are a little bit more accepting, especially in bigger cities. But when you're in rural, like even today, right? We're talking 2025, even in rural areas, even in the North, it's not always fully accepted. I just think that it's a very dangerous notion, and that wasn't necessarily important to why Georgia became the way she was. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Anyway, we're going to continue on. Georgia was little more than a baby when she began suffering the insults that would shape her future. And those of millions of others, she was an active child who loved to run and play. George, however, forced her to spend long hours in the parlor, practicing the piano. Quote, I was glued on a piano stool at 5, and I didn't entirely get away from the piano until I was grown, she told a friend, Memphis reporter Ada Gilkey, in 1935. But although Georgia despised playing the piano, she played it, hopeful that compliance would earn her something she desperately wanted. All the time, she said, I wanted to be a lawyer. The main route to becoming a lawyer in the South during the early 1900s was to, quote-unquote, read law with an established attorney. And I read law with my father and passed the state bar examination in Mississippi. But he wouldn't let me practice it because it wasn't the usual thing for a woman, and I was the only girl in the family. Her father's refusal to let her practice the law he taught her may have been the ultimate frustration, but Georgia had probably long resented submitting to George. It was not her nature to be compliant, arrogant, condescending, so confident that she hadn't actually become famous. She would have been grandiose. Georgia would control everyone in her life but George. And while she was unable to defy him by practicing law, she searched hard for an alternative profession. Okay, so going back to my thought, right, of the rivalry. While there may have been a small rivalry between her and her brother, like it doesn't really go into it, I think overall she just wanted, like most kids, wanted the acceptance of her parents, especially that of her father, right? To follow your passion, right? Yeah, I don't want to say it was like in a revenge sort of way that she went this route, but like, had she just been able to be accepted for who she was, in terms of being able to practice law, could she have a little bit more empathy? I don't know. I think she just kind of is who she was. I think she already lacked a lot of empathy and was very narcissistic in nature, as they claim. I don't think that might have changed all that much. I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, had Georgia been born before 1891, she would have had almost no choice of profession at all. Women were considered intellectually inferior, fit only for marriage and bearing children. Even women who wished to remain single often married, since they had no way of supporting themselves. Some married homosexual women found solace in quote-unquote romantic friendships, passionate, loving, and often sexual relationships with other women. It wasn't widely recognized until the 20th century that women could be homosexual, and romantic friendships were sentimentalized and considered ennobling. Both heterosexual and homosexual women were often forced to channel their intellectual drives into activities like gardening or needlepoint. Georgia and other independent-minded young women would expand their options through education in women's colleges. The first such school was at Mount Holyoke College, established in Massachusetts in 1837. That's so funny. We just passed Holyoke on the way to and from Salem to get back to New York. But yeah, I should have stopped. Had I read this chapter before I left, I don't know, maybe went by it. But yeah, kind of interesting, all of this stuff, right? Martha Washington College in Abingdon, Virginia, from which Georgia would graduate, opened in 1860. By 1880, 40,000 women, representing one-third of the university student population of the United States, were enrolled in 153 colleges and universities. A large number would remain single. A study cited by Lillian Fatterman in Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, A History of Lesbian Life in the 20th Century America, found that 50% of female college graduates between 1880 and 1900 were unmarried, compared to 10% of American women in general. It's unclear how many college graduates remained single out of choice, and how many were simply considered too educated to be suitable wives. But women's colleges were provided welcome refuge for young women like Georgia who desired autonomy. For the first time in history, large numbers of women lived and learned together, heady with the excitement of pioneering and anxious to work at a profession. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. To this day, in 2025, women, specifically Black women, are the most educated. Now, in terms of being single versus married, I don't know that number, but as someone who is college educated, I have been told I've been too smart to be in a relationship. I've been told that, I'm too good, or I'm not good enough, basically, to submit to a man. This is, again, we're talking over 100-year difference, right? I was born 100 years to the day of Georgia Tanner. I know it sounds crazy. And as women, this is like a whole other topic, right? As women, we still experience many of the same things, right? It really hasn't changed all that much. And I say all that much as in we're still treated similarly, right? Especially if you are considered a person of color, right? If you are Black, Indigenous, a Pacific Islander, Asian, right? If you are not presenting as white, right, you are treated as different. Now, that's not to say that white women don't also get treated that way. But white women, from all of these laws and pushing DEIA and all that, white women still benefit the most from all this. So when we're getting rid of it, right, because of the Trump era, right, the Republicans and all that, white women are suffering the most. So, yeah, anyway. In terms of, like, benefits. All right, continuing on. Where were we? Oh, Georgia's experiences in college must also have assured that she could have a professional life that didn't involve marriage. Many female professors lived in quote-unquote Boston marriages, domestic and often love partnerships with other women. They wore rings and called each other sister. Georgia would follow both of these practices with her partner, Anne Atwood Hollingsworth. As a college student, Georgia would probably also have been aware of loving relationships between female students. What were considered crushes between girls at women's colleges were oh my gosh, ubiquitous and had many names: rave, spoon, pash, or for passion, smash, gonzo, gone on, flame. Crushes between young women were so accepted that all female dances were held at the Smith and Vassar during the early 20th century. Students attended in pairs, with one partner dressed in a feminine manner and the other in a male attire. I don't know if Georgia had a love relationship during college, but she graduated with no apparent inclination towards marriage. To support herself, she needed a job in one of the two acceptable careers for women: teaching and social work. Georgia majored in music after graduating in 1913, taught school briefly in Columbus, Mississippi, but she lacked the requisite passion for teaching. She may well have considered it an old-fashioned profession. All right, pausing there, because I did teach. You really do have to have a passion. It's very easy, in my opinion, to lose that passion. Now, don't get me wrong, I still teach to some degree, although not in a school. Don't get me wrong, I love the kids, and I know a lot of, teachers that really love the kids and miss, having retired or left the profession, miss the kids, but it's more the administration that really put the pressure on. And now she then went into social work, and I want to make this clear. You also have to have a lot of passion for social work. I've been told for majority of my adult life, you would make a wonderful social worker. And I'm looking at people like, hell no. I may be passionate, I may be empathetic, but I know that I could not do that work, right? And I have a lot of love for everyone who does go into it and really makes a big difference, that including my adoptive mom. But it is not for everyone. And unfortunately, we hear so many stories of social workers who are not empathetic, who really put their own biases into things. And this is why when I talk about finding a therapist, right, it could be a social worker, finding a therapist that is competent. Because unfortunately, even to this day, majority of them are not competent in adoption. And you really have to understand there's a lot of underlying trauma. And there's a lot of social workers out there who have adopted, who don't take all of this into consideration, or who think, oh, but not my child, right? And that may not be the case, right? And I feel like, don't get me wrong, love my mom, but I feel like my mom did exactly that. As trauma-informed and as best as she did, there were a lot of things that she missed when I was a kid. And I'm looking at her like, how the heck did you miss this? Like, wasn't it quite obvious? now we laugh about it, right? Like, we can have that conversation. But, you know, when your child is going through extreme anxiety and, you know, clearly has signs of autism and all of this, it's like, you sure you're good? You sure you shouldn't have tested me? Okay. All right, cool. Anyway, let's continue on. Social work, however, was in its infancy. Georgia was also familiar with social work. Having long practiced a form of it herself, charity work was a refuge during her adolescence, perhaps providing an excuse for her absence from local parties and dances. While other girls primped for them, she donned starched long-sleeved blouses and skirts that swept the floor and visited the local poor. Georgia may have been motivated in part by altruism, but at an early age she began depersonalizing the adults and children she helped. This depersonalization was encouraged by both by the Southern culture, which deprecated poor whites, and Georgia's increasing self-absorption. But even empathetic people sometimes become callous to protect themselves from pain. And although Georgia may never have been particularly empathetic, she was affected by her encounter with a drugged baby. The child's mother was addicted to morphine, a major ingredient in cough medicine sold over the counter. During the early 20th century, authorities often sent drug abusers to insane asylums as punishment. When Georgia was very young, a Mississippi sheriff institutionalized this mother along with several of her children. Hours later, Georgia told Memphis reporter Ada Gilkey the mother cried out something about her baby as the effects of the dope began to wear off. Officials at the institution called my father about it. The whole family had retired, but we got up and drove into the country, and there, under a pile of filthy rags, in a corner of a shack, we found a pitiful baby, which had evidently been given a little of the dope. Again, we're talking cough medicine. The baby had cough medicine, okay? Like, let's remember that. The Tans brought the baby home. Georgia noticed the baby and quite possibly grew attached to it, but eventually it and other children were sent to an orphanage. The incident, Georgia said in 1935, first informed her of the plight of young and neglected children. The experience may also have encouraged her to avoid further emotional involvement with a child. For a woman who would work for decades in adoption and who would take great pride in her placements, Georgia seemed curiously immune to children's charms. She had no favorites among the babies in the home, her former employee May Hinman told me. She was businesslike and treated them all the same. Georgia's 2 grandchildren, who live in California and Texas, said that she had been emotionally cold even to their mother, June, the daughter Georgia adopted in the 1920s. So yeah, she really didn't care. I felt like she was kind of going with the norms, you know. I think this lady just really had no empathy and was just very narcissistic. I'm going to say she sounds like a psychopath, right? Little to no emotion, just I cannot imagine, I'm trying to say this. I cannot imagine not working with children and not feeling some sort of pull, right? Even when I taught, you know, there was a connection with each and every one of my students. It was different, right? I still think about them, right? How are they doing? You know, oh my God, they're all like 13 now. I feel old because this was preschool, but I feel where are they? Have they moved? Because some of the kids were international. And I just hope for good things, right? Now, granted, none of them were adoptees, as far as we knew. But, like, I've worked with children for most of my life as soon as I started working, right? I babysat, I lifeguarded, I taught swimming. I did work a little bit of retail and stuff, and I did do pastry as well. But I also taught classes for cooking. That's what I mostly do now, on the side. But I cannot imagine not having a connection with the child, right? And especially as a mother, not having a connection with your own child. Now, I know that there are women who have no motherly instincts, right? And I want to make it clear that, no, not everyone is born with it. But if you are going to take in a child in any form of safe external care, you would hope that you would provide love and stabilization and more. This woman just didn't care, right? Towards her own daughter, June, towards her grandchildren, towards any child that she came into contact with. Just such a lack of emotion, which is very, was it psychopath, sociopath? One of those. I cannot imagine. All right, continuing on. My mother promised to raise us very differently from how Georgia had raised her. Georgia's granddaughter, Vici, told me 10 years after June's death. She said Georgia was a cold fish. She gave her material things and nothing else. When June began to menstruate, she ran to Georgia in the middle of the night, terrified she was dying. Georgia turned her over to the maid and went back to sleep. The maids raised her, said Vici. I don't know why Georgia bothered to adopt her. The reason would become clear in time. It would involve her father, the most influential person in her life. Georgia's feelings toward him were a mix of love and hate, and wanting to prove herself to him and to defy him. The incident involving the drugged baby was a prototype for her relationship with George, evoking admiration for his stature in the community and quite possibly rage at him for ultimately institutionalizing the baby. George's experience with the drugged infant also affected something of greater significance than her relationship with her father. Her treatment of poor, white, often single mothers. Some of the disdain Georgia felt toward them were probably related to class differences, but the incompetence of the drugged baby's mother may have made Georgia feel justified in her contempt. Utterly unappreciative of ambiguity, she considered the world to be inhabited by two wildly divergent types. Poor people, including the single mothers she called cows, were bad. Wealthy people, whom she described of the higher type, were good. Some of this obtuseness may have been simulated, meant to excuse her crimes, but Georgia would argue and would seem to believe that poor people were incapable of poor parenting. Their children needed rescue. Georgia would save them by seizing them and placing them for adoption. So this is kind of what people still think of with the classism, and that poor people can't provide for their children, and that there's a lot of eugenics between it and the whole saviorism aspect. This is really what people think, right? Still to this day, we're still arguing this point. That is not true, that we should provide resources, because why are we selling children? That is human trafficking. You are getting a baby in exchange, or you're paying money for the quote-unquote adoption fees and obtaining a baby. That is still selling a child. It doesn't have to be for sexual needs, right? But you're playing into the fantasy role of being a quote-unquote family. And I want to make it very clear, it is okay to be child-free. It is okay to have animals and call them your children. It is okay. Okay? You do not have to have a child in your care to become a family. If you and your partner are together, you can consider yourself a family. Families look completely different and different sizes, and that's okay. All right, I want to make that clear. Let's stop with this bullshit. All right, continuing on. An incident that occurred when, according to Memphis reporter Ada Gilkey, Georgia was a mere slip of a girl, may have further inclined her towards social work. She also taught her how to wreak mild revenge on her father. A policeman knew of her work, and the poor asked for her help. An infant had been left in a basket on a doorstep, and the policeman didn't know how to care for it. Georgia traveled with the baby and the policeman in a patrol car to the Meridian courthouse, where the child would be declared legally abandoned. As she emerged from the black Maria, or paddy wagon, the infant in her arms, she met her father and several attorneys from New York. Embarrassed, George gulped, "Gentlemen, this is my daughter." Laughing, introductions were made, and in the years that followed, Judge Tan was to get used to most anything where his daughter was concerned. Ada Gilkey reported in 1935, Georgia, she wrote, would never forget the expression on George's face and how he'd fought to maintain his composure. Around 1906, when Georgia would have been 15, she arranged her first adoption of 2 children she found huddled in a corner of her father's courtroom. He had placed them in, quote-unquote, in the protection of the Mississippi Children's Home Society, which, like other orphanages of the time, would have been more likely to warehouse them or place them in foster care than arrange their adoption. Within 3 weeks, however, Georgia persuaded a respected Mississippi couple to adopt the 5-year-old boy and his 3-year-old sister. Georgia discussed this placement with Ada Gilkey in 1935. The article that ran in the Memphis Press Scimitar didn't reveal how the children had become separated from their birth parents, but Georgia's description of the family is telling, indicative of the attitudes that would inform her business, and that she would incorporate into the institution of adoption. The father was a man of intelligence, but of a mean disposition that was always getting him into trouble, Georgia said. The mother was from an ordinary poor family. The children were sweet, attractive in appearance. The girl now has a degree in music. The boy has finished his law degree and begun his practice. Each were given an opportunity and made the most of it. So again, this is, now granted this is from Georgia's words herself, but indicating the same things that we hear of this, quote-unquote bullshit of adoption. Oh, you're given a chance. Oh, you have better opportunities. Oh, you're placed into a loving, stable home, as if their biological parents couldn't provide. We don't actually know what was happening with that situation, right? Or how they could get back on their feet, because things happen. But this is the same bullshit that we hear to this day, that children deserve to be ripped from their biological families to be quote-unquote saved. Or recently I heard, oh, it's quote-unquote God's plan for people to adopt. No, it's not. Okay, continuing on. Referring to this incident, in 1946, a Memphis reporter wrote, Miss Tan had found her life's work. Georgia certainly did find her vocation early, although it's impossible to know whether her realization of it was triggered by these first adoptions rather than the rescue of the drugged baby. The ride in the Black Maria with the abandoned infant, or an incident lost to history, her father's work and her environment would have constantly reminded her of the needs of the homeless children. When I was growing up, there were orphanages all over the South. Attorney and former investigator Robert Taylor told me. Remember, Robert Taylor was the man who was hired to investigate Georgia Tann's crimes and then was blocked at every turn. The attorney, after Georgia's death, vainly tried to conduct a thorough investigation into her black market dealings. Taylor, who was born in Tennessee in 1915, almost the same year Georgia began her earliest professional social work. Finding adoptive homes for institutionalized orphans could have kept Georgia busy for decades. Unfortunately, she wouldn't be satisfied with merely finding homes for homeless children. She'd become obsessed with finding adoptive homes for children who already had homes. She would acquire these children through kidnapping or deceit, and if she saved them from anything, it was poverty. Georgia considered poverty the worst possible condition. It was her upbringing. She was from a very snobbish family and looked down on the people in those shanty houses who got their hands dirty for a living. Andre Bond of Biloxi, Mississippi told me. Georgia felt she was taking children from trashy people and elevating the children. Christine Nyland of Nashville said, Christine had been adopted through Georgia by a cultured, educated family whom Georgia frequently visited. It was as if she thought, there's something that doesn't belong over there. That doesn't belong over here. I'll put it over there, Christine told me. Georgia often boasted about having placed children with high-type adoptive parents, and she expected grieving birth parents to be comforted by this fact. Again, the bullshit of, oh, it's okay, your children are better off. Oh, it's okay, you can never provide for them. Just forget it like they never existed. It's the same type of bullshit that we hear, right? It's not rainbows and butterflies. This is literally human trafficking. This is kidnapping. This is very triggering too. Okay, sorry. When a young mother begged for the return of the 3 children Georgia had stolen in 1939, Georgia told her that her appropriation of them was for their welfare, that they'd received good homes and splendid educations. Georgia's attorney, Abe Waldauer, a cultured, educated, adoptive parent himself, also equated affluence with happiness. In a May 1935 letter to Mississippi lawyer representing a father who was protesting Georgia's placement of his child for adoption, Waldauer wrote, "The child is fortunately placed in a home capable of lavishing every affection and advantage which wealth can give. The woman who believed the end justified any means may have considered the means warranted even when they killed a child. She seemed undisturbed by the deaths of scores of children in her care. A child who died as a result of her social engineering would, at least, not have to grow up poor. And there were always more children to rescue." Of course, Georgia's career provided her with the benefits other than the satisfaction of making poor children middle class. She became wealthy and influential. Because of her own accomplishments and reflected glory, she liked being on a first-name basis with the prominent people who adopted her children: movie stars, directors, politicians. Former investigator Robert Taylor told me she wasn't above exaggerating her connections to prominent people, Taylor added. Near the end of her life, she hung autographed photographs of clients Joan Crawford and June Allison in her hospital room. The autographs were forged, signed at Georgia's direction by her employees. She also instructed her workers to send her get well cards and to sign the actress's and President Truman's name to the cards. Around 1906, 15-year-old Georgia Tann may have had an intimidation of the reward she'd reap from her future profession when she accomplished what her father had considered impossible: the adoptive placement of the young brother and sister she'd found in the courtroom. 8 years later, having graduated from college, rejected teaching, and having been forbidden to practice law, Georgia chose social work as her profession. It was a profession that offered opportunity. The photographs of New York City street children taken by Jacob Riis had led to an outpouring of private volunteer activities, which resulted in the establishment of humane societies, juvenile courts, and institutions of orphans. So when we talk about humane societies, we're talking about what was then of children, the home societies, which we'll dive deeper into. We're not talking about animals, although I have mentioned that the man who created ASPCA had helped put laws on the books, right? It was a group that had asked him to help because he had already got laws in place, stricter laws in terms of animal abuse, and it was with his help that they were able to get child abuse laws started, and this was the late 1880s, early 1890s. But again, even to this day, animals have more laws about abuse and care than children do. So just keep that in mind. I'm not trying to compare us. I'm just letting you guys know that there is a history of a link between us. So yeah, anyway. Okay, continuing on. Over 460 orphanages were established in the United States between 1890 and 1910. When Georgia graduated from college in 1913, Mississippi had 3 professional, religiously affiliated orphanages. An orphanage operated by Fraternal Order of Masons was located in Meriden. Georgia had volunteered her services there during summer vacations. In 1912, the first state orphanage, the Mississippi Children's Home Finding Society, was also established in Meriden. Georgia obtained employment with the organization, and after its headquarters were relocated to Jackson in 1916, took a profession there as a field agent. One of her duties was the placement of orphans in foster homes. Adoption was so uncommon then that even the most altruistic social workers believed the only way to spare homeless children incarceration in Spartan institutions was to place them in quote-unquote work homes in which they earned their keep by performing menial chores. So they're talking about like orphan trains, okay? Just keeping that in mind. Georgia would prove far more resourceful. Sorry about that. I was interrupted. Anyway, where were we? Georgia would prove far more resourceful than other social workers in arranging adoptions. She also reaped very different benefits from social work. Ethical workers found satisfaction in helping others. Georgia considered social work a vehicle through which to achieve power, adulation, wealth, prestige, goals that would seem unattainable to even the most ambitious social workers today, who would be constrained by agency policy. But the field's lack of regulation in the early 20th century left children vulnerable, particularly in Mississippi. Children adopted elsewhere were generally their adoptive parents' heirs. Mississippi residents, however, were allowed to adopt with the condition that the children wouldn't inherit from them. Apologies, I had a very important phone call. Continuing on, so I'm going to repeat a little bit of this paragraph. Children adopted elsewhere were generally their adoptive parents' heirs. Mississippi residents, however, were allowed to adopt with the condition that their children wouldn't inherit from them, a condition deplored by the state's ethical social workers, who realized these children would be treated as servants. Georgia's supervisors at the Mississippi Children's Home Finding Society had begun providing financial aid to the relatives of orphans so that children could remain with their families of birth, which is important. We want that. We like that. Now, does that mean that they're always safe? Of course not, but that is a step in the right direction. Now, of course, we're not talking about Georgia. We're talking about the actual other administrators. Okay. Her colleagues. Now, there are still states where it says if you're adopted, you are technically not considered the heir of your adoptive parents. I don't know how that works with wills. I think if a person has a will and you're named on it, then it doesn't matter. But legally speaking, I think we're going to have to dive into that. But yeah, I have heard that, and I think it is still relevant in some states like Mississippi. Again, we're going to have to deep dive into that. But in terms of a will, I'm pretty sure if you have a written one, right, then it goes to whoever's on that will, right? You can divide it however you want. But if something were to just happen to you, right? Sorry, I'm not trying to put this on anyone. Just say that you got really, really sick tomorrow and passed away, whatever. Something happens, right? And you didn't have that will, then it's supposed to go to your next living relative, right? That could be your spouse, that could be your child, that could be your parent. But if you're adopted, right, and you're the next person, they don't necessarily consider you the next heir, right? So it would then skip to a sibling of the person if there's no spouse or another child. Anyway, yeah, that is right. We're supposed to be all equal, but we're really treated differently. It's a lack of a human right. Isn't that beautiful? Anyway, continuing on. Georgia, who lacked her colleagues' scruples, considered adoptive placement a business. In another departure from previous adoption practices, she considered her clients to be the prospective adoptive parents who would make her wealthy rather than the babies she placed. Sorry, guys, I have been interrupted many times today. She was equally unconcerned with the rights of birth parents. In 1992, I spoke with a woman whose grandmother, Rose Harvey, may have been one of the first mothers Georgia harmed. Rose encountered Georgia in 1922, approximately 16 years after Georgia's first adoptive placement. By then, she had apparently stepped over the line. She wasn't simply finding adoptive homes for orphans, but for children she'd kidnapped. One spring morning, she drove her Model T to a cabin in Jasper County, near her Hickory hometown. Asleep inside was Rose Harvey, who was a young, poor, widowed, and pregnant, and suffering from diabetes. Her 2-year-old son, Onyx, played on the back porch. Georgia lured the sturdy, black-haired, brown-eyed boy into her car. George's father, George C. Tan, signed papers declaring Rose Harvey an unfit mother, and young Onyx an abandoned child. She literally just kidnapped the child. Hey, kid, Onyx, come get my car. Yeah, you're gonna be in a new home now. That is so illegal. How? Okay. But people see her as a hero in the adoptive community, right? Unless you're an adoptee or have actual empathy. Where were we? Onyx was placed with an adoptive family headed by a man named Rufus Raspberry. Shortly afterward, Onyx's 3-year-old brother was also taken from his mother and placed with Rufus's brother Clyde. Heart-stricken and incensed, Rose sued to regain her children unsuccessfully. George may have intervened, but George's child-placing practices may have angered some local residents. She was run out of town shortly after placing Rose's little boys for adoption. I have been unable to learn if this is the case or some other unknown one was the cause. Her father had friends in Memphis after working briefly for a Texas orphanage. She got a job with the Memphis branch of the Tennessee Children's Home Society and moved there in July of 1924. Okay, so this makes more sense why she left Mississippi and went to Memphis, right? We did hear that she was forced out in other sources, but this kind of explains why, right? Local residents being upset with her, like, how dare you? George, her father, Judge George Tan, also not a very nice person, really could have intervened and said, like, hey, no, this is kidnapping. What did you do? Let's correct this, right? But he didn't. He supported his daughter's actions, which is extremely harmful and, again, has long-lasting impacts. Anyway, tomorrow we're going to read Chapter 7, George's Memphis. This will talk about her time at the the Tennessee Children's Home Society in Memphis from July of 1924 up until around her death. So I will see you guys tomorrow for that, and I hope that you guys all practice some self-care.